All right, good morning. It is April 29th, and we've had the traditional Ohio spring weather in the last 2 weeks. So some snow, some stinking hot weather, and some rain. And we are in that process of starting to warm up. Online today, we got Dr. Dominic Petrella and Dr. David Gardner. It is exam time, so a lot of the faculty from the turf team are caught with those activities, as well as getting in grades and ruining students' lives in perpetuity, of course. With that, I will leave Dr. Gardner to take us away on the weed magic carpet.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Let me share my screen real quick. All right. So wanted to talk a little bit about winter annual weeds. If you're having a problem with them, they're probably becoming very noticeable because they're blooming and they're getting very, very large. Last week, a week ago today, I started a small trial. I've been talking about this periodically in this forum for the last year, commenting on the merits of potentially using chelated iron for the control of winter annuals. So I thought I would throw out a little demonstration trial. Chelated iron is that natural herbicide, or well, it's the product that people use when they're not allowed to use conventional pesticides. So, like in Canada and places like that. It's pretty expensive, but if you spot spray it, that can make it a lot more reasonable. Anyway, this is only a week old, but it's a mixed stand of chickweed that you can see is in bloom, and then also dandelions that are in bloom. This is what I have gotten so far with the three-way herbicide that I am comparing it to. So, there's a myriad of formulations that combine 2,4-D, MCPP, and dicamba for weed control. The dandelions are going down pretty good, but you see the chickweed is not really affected yet. We'll see if that progresses over the course of the next week or so. I took these pictures just yesterday, so that was six days after application, but compared to the chelated iron treated plots, the winter annual weed, the chickweed, is controlled pretty effectively. And I've also seen similar results anecdotally with like hairy bittercress and some of the other winter annuals. So again, from a dollar per acre perspective, that chelated iron material can be pretty expensive, but if you're at your wit's end with winter annual weed control and you've tried not only the three-way herbicides, but some of the other herbicides that combine a fourth ingredient like speed zone, T-zone, 4-speed, etc., and you're not having any luck, I have seen pretty good results with this chelated iron material. It's a contact herbicide, but winter annual weeds should be more susceptible because they don't have the underground parts that make them a perennial, right? So control could potentially be pretty good. But I'll keep you up to date as that study progresses. Now, I'm starting to get a lot of calls from folks and then also samples sent in. The question being, what is this grass that I have in this lawn? And at this time of year, there's a lot of grasses that occur in the environment that really don't fall into the category of being either a desired turf grass, nor do we see them prevalently enough to really consider them a weed. So things like meadow fescue, the Deschampsias, calarias, red top bent, timothy, downy brome, sweet vernal grass, etc. There's a myriad of grasses that can tolerate mowing that, like I said, they don't really fit into either category of being either a desired turf grass nor prevalent enough that we really bother with trying to control them. But when it comes to identifying these miscellaneous grasses, oftentimes I have to resort to the use of the inflorescence. You can use morphological structures for some of the more commonly observed ones like downy brome and quackgrass and orchard grass, tall fescue growing where it's not supposed to. But generally speaking, if the grass that you're seeing isn't one of the four that I just mentioned, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to kind of, I don't want to say disappear, but as the other cool season grasses get going, it's going to fade into the background and it's not going to be a bother. If you are having difficulty identifying a grass, do feel free to send either pictures to me, or you can send a sample. You can send me an email and I can give you an address where you can send a sample I'll try to identify it using morphological structures, but there's a decent chance that I'll have to grow it out and get a seed head. So I mean, that could take a little while. The bottom line is this, with those grasses, if they're green at this time of the year, the chances that there's a selective control is pretty small, okay? The list that you see here, you can use chlorsulfuron to take tall fescue only out of Kentucky bluegrass. If there's any perennial ryegrass in that stand, you really can't use that there because chlorsulfuron is pretty hot on perennial ryegrass too. You can take bent grass out of other turf grasses with mesotrione. Field paspalum isn't really visible yet. The stolons are there and they're obviously visible, but the leaves haven't emerged yet. So my point is that if you see a grass that's green right now, there's a decent chance that there's not a selective herbicide for it. So the question becomes, is it an annual grass that's going to go away? Or is it a perennial grass that's going to persist and be a problem? Or, like I said, is it one of those that is just going to kind of, it doesn't fit into this category of being either a desirable grass or a weed, and so it's going to just kind of become less noticeable as the cool season grasses get going and growing. So, you know, the thing I would recommend is, you know, keep a lookout for it. If it's still obviously visible in June, then, you know, you should consider trying to get rid of it if it's a problem. You know, determine whether or not it's an annual or a perennial grass. But like I said, a lot of times I see grasses at this time of year that, you know, people don't know what they are. I have trouble figuring them out. And the good news is that they just kind of disappear or fade into the background as the season progresses. One other thing to mention, as we're getting into the season, last year I went off on what I hoped was an apolitical rant about the warming of our climate. This is the hardiness zone map from the 1970s. And we were a zone 5 region here in Ohio, okay, with average annual minimum temperatures between -10 and -20 degrees. And they updated that map about 15 years ago and made us a zone 6 region where we're supposed to have annual minimum temperatures between 0 and -10. Well, this year was another year here in Columbus where the low temperature was 11 above 0, which is actually the equivalent of zone 8. So what you would expect to see in southern Georgia in the 1970s or northern Georgia today. The 25-year average here in Columbus is actually zone 7A. And so again, we don't have to get into, you know, like what's causing this. But, you know, those of you that deal with landscape ornamentals too, you've probably noticed that there's a variety of plants that you can grow here in Ohio now that you used to not be able to, like crepe myrtles or glossiobelia or southern magnolias, passion flowers, crocosmia, etc. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of weeds that we didn't used to see in Ohio that we do now, such as false green kalinga, or field paspalum, or here's our new one. This is what I want some help with. If anybody sees this, send me an email. We're trying to track the spread of this particular weed here in Ohio. This is Virginia buttonweed. So this is one of the bigger weed problems in southern turf, and this was found on a golf course in the Cincinnati area last year. So this is a perennial. It's actually related to coffee, which, you know, that doesn't really help us any, but it's one of the most difficult weeds to control on southern turf. They usually resort to using glyphosate when the Bermuda grass is dormant. And if you think about it, that's a problem for us because there's not really a good time of the year for us to be spraying glyphosate because our cool season grasses don't really ever go dormant, right? So cross-shaped flowers, long vines, it's a very difficult weed to control. There are a couple of selective post-emergence herbicides that are recommended, so like clopyralid or fluroxapyr in combination herbicides. But again, this is a weed that can be quite difficult to control. And like I said, it's here in Ohio now, so if you see it, you know, drop me a line, send me an email. I'd like to know about it. And that's all I have for today.
Thanks, Dave. That's superbly depressing. We appreciate the fact you're telling us we're getting overgrown by invasive weeds, but such is life.
But it gives me something to do.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Following up from that, Dr. Petrella coming to us from the office behind me, which is why we both disappeared at the same time to swap a pack of the staples. Dr. Petrella.
Yeah, excuse the disappearance act there. All right, so this is kind of a requested talk / pertinent talk because right now is grant writing season. So not only wrapping up finals, but we're putting in grants to try to secure funding. So talk briefly about how much does research cost, where we get our research from, and in a little bit kind of soliciting donations to the Ohio Turfgrass Research and Trust. So we get our funding two different ways, either through hard funding or soft funding. Hard funding would be classified as kind of guaranteed money from the university. This is mostly gone across the board, across every university in the United States. This might have paid for staff salaries, maybe some graduate student salaries, graduate student tuition. We're lucky in that actually the Department of HCS here at Ohio State does help pay for graduate student tuition. So that's a way we do get a little bit of quote unquote hard funding. Space maintenance and fees, so plot fees, stuff like that. And last but not least, program funding. So money that was used for extension and outreach, that might have been funding given to travel to extension events. That's gone. So most of our funding we have to get for everything we do is called soft funding. And that's money raised by faculty and staff through grants, through sponsored research trials, and donations, okay? Some of this though does have stipulations. So if we get a grant for a specific project, that money is meant to be used for that specific project. And we can't use it for, let's say, to look at PGR rates on USGA putting greens. It needs to be spent for a specific project. So let's see if that slide's gonna go forward. So what does funding actually go to? Okay, so I'll refer to you to a GCM article put out by Eric Watkins in 2020. So this was March 2020 and page 30 in GCM. It describes a little bit what we're talking about. So most of our money that we raise goes to funding staff and student salary and benefits. So generally grants, 60% to 70% of the funding that goes to grants is to pay for people. A graduate student for their stipend and their tuition can be up to $50,000 per year. So you're looking for, let's say a master's student that might be 2 to 3 years, you're looking at $100,000, $150,000 just to pay them and pay their tuition. The same thing it goes for paying for staff. So we need help to do research, and we're looking to pay people good money, $50,000 to $60,000. So most money we raise goes towards paying people, just like what you're doing. We look for money to help pay for undergraduate researchers. That's a way to train students, but also a way to help supplement them so they can make money while they're in school. Sometimes we have to pay space fees, user fees. That might be money towards using grow chambers or plot space. Purchasing supplies. So simple supplies, fertilizer, lab supplies, seed, etc. Analytical fees. So if we're looking to do any type of genetics, any type of quantifying sugars, quantifying hormones, that's an extra cost. That might be up to, let's say $10,000 to $20,000 of a grant. Travel. So we need to go to meetings. So present at scientific meetings, present at outreach events. We have to charge that to a grant. So for example, Ed and I are putting a grant together now where $12,000 of that money from the grant is used to help pay us to travel for certain events for that grant. And then last but not least, indirect costs. So this is definitely a contentious point that everybody complains about, but that's what we call overhead or F&A fees or facilities and admin costs. So when we get a grant, the university does get a cut. On federal grants, and most of our grants, that's about 42%. So the university gets 42%. It varies from university and department to department what that money goes towards. So here, let's say ATI with Ed and I, the university is 42% of that final dollar amount. 25% goes to the main university costs. 25% goes to our business office to help pay people to help write the grant. And we actually get 45% of our overhead back. So in that example, overhead ain't that bad because we get that overhead back to be able to use to purchase equipment and other supplies. Other universities are different. That faculty person might not see any of their overhead back. So again, I don't want to get into the gory details, but indirect costs aren't always bad. So a minimum for a project, a 2-year master's project, generally costs $100,000 to $200,000. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about where we can try to get that type of money. So we can get that through sponsored trials. So we might work, or Dave might work for and do a project associated with a new herbicide coming out. Dave might raise some money for that trial, and Dave can use that money to help pay for students. We might raise some funding from a local GCSA chapter let's say they want to support some of our research. We can get some funding from OTF through the Ohio Turfgrass Foundation and Trust. So that's money that is donated to the OTRT. The OTRT as a board then gets together and determines how that money should be used for research here at Ohio State. Generally, money from these types of projects garner less than $10,000 per year. Remember, I mentioned it can cost upwards of $50,000 per year for a graduate student. The next level would be national organizations, so like the GCSAA, specifically EIFG, and the USGA. And I have the STMA here. The STMA does give some research funding, but it is relatively low. The USGA especially, we can get grants upwards of $150,000 for 2 years. So the USGA is a great supporter of turfgrass research, specifically golf course, focused research, but they also fund research that's not golf specific. So they are a long-standing supporter of what we do. Last but not least are state departments of ag. So like the Ohio Department of Ag, for example. So they have funding programs called the Specialty Crop Block Grant. So turfgrass is classified as a specialty crop, and we can target specific monies for specialty crops only. These types of grants can get us upwards of $150,000 for a 2-year project. That can cover most of the project. Again, that might not cover everything. We have to actually get some money from somewhere else to finish it off. Federal grants are our big blockbusters. Those are things like the USDA, the NSF. Some turfgrass research, you get money from the DoD. Generally, though, these are multi-state cooperative grants. So these are grants that, let's say, Ohio State, Michigan State, Minnesota, Wisconsin, we all work together on one grant. And that might be a multi-million-dollar grant that we split some of that pot up. So generally, for these federal grants, we're able to raise over $200,000 for a 2 to 4 year grant. So these grants we can use to support multiple graduate students, multiple staff people, and you usually can get enough funding to do more basic research. And last but not least, our university competitive funding. So these can be seed grants. So a seed grant might be a small pot of money, like say $10,000 to $25,000. That's meant to help us to develop preliminary research to go after these big federal grants. And then last but not least, our equipment grants. So unfortunately, most grant money cannot be used to purchase equipment. Okay, that's anything over $5,000. So for us to actually purchase equipment, we need equipment-specific grants. And those are competitive grants through the university. So we can kind of break down, what these levels of funding usually get us. So that high-level funding from like USDA, again, it's collaborative research, it's broad impact. So this high-level funding is meant to be broad. How do we solve problems for many, many people across the United States? It's generally funding towards high-cut turf, okay? It might be problems associated with pollution and runoff, breeding, et cetera. It's usually less quote-unquote turfy research, okay? It's collaborative. We might be working with people in physics. We might be working with people in the College of Mathematics, okay? It's some applied research, but a lot of it's basic research to look for and solve future issues, okay? So that big funding is meant for us not to necessarily solve immediate issues, but it's aimed towards solving those big future issues. Next would be that medium level funding. That's money from like the USGA, the ODA, some USDA funding. Like this is more turf and sport specific money. So if you had a question specifically for how to manage golf course turf, athletic field turf, we'd be getting a medium level of funding for mostly very applied research to solve immediate needs or immediate issues. So if you have a question right now about, like Dave was talking about, control of a specific weed or a new and emerging pest, we might be able to get some ODA funding specifically towards how to solve that current and emerging pest. And that might partially pay for a graduate student. Then at the bottom, we have the lower level funding. By lower level, I mean just a smaller cut of money. That might be money, some like from the OTRT or regional chapters. We can look at that as seed funding or a small pot of money helping to write a future larger grant. That might be partial support. So OTRT might be able to give us $5,000 to help pay for part of a staff person. This is meant for a very immediate industry needs, okay? And they're very industry-focused projects, so they're very lawn-specific, golf-specific, sports-specific. Again, I'll reiterate that OTF has the Ohio Turfgrass Foundation and Trust, so they have a pot of money that's donated by any individual, and that board gets to sit down together and we write them grant proposals, and that board chooses what type of projects to fund. And they're able to give us between $10,000 and $15,000 to help fund the research that you want us to do. So we have a survey out there now aimed at trying to see what you want us to do. From that survey, then OTRT will be able to go back and then help divvy out funds for research that you will want us to do. All right. Again, email if you have any questions. More than happy to talk about it.
Thanks, Dr. Petrella. You've now irritated every single administrator in the university by giving all away the stories and secrets, but okay. From an agronomic standpoint, a couple of things. We've seen some white tea activity, and also even with the cold snap, there was still some red thread activity showing up on those lower input areas. Soil temperatures in the Cleveland area on a modified 2-inch depth. You're looking average for the last 4 to 5 days, 62, 62, 55, 46, 46 degrees for the averages. Now, if you look at some of the timings and trackers, it is about the sweet spot for the application of your DMIs, your early season DMIs, which need to be washed down into the soil profile. So keep that in mind. And I'd expect, based on the forecast, that after this weekend, we're probably going to start to see a little bit more of a consistent warming pattern. So activity will increase. Do be aware your bent grass is still probably sitting on your greens, kind of kicking rocks, because soil temperatures have not really averaged out at the 55 consistently yet, but that we're getting there. And so I'd expect that clipping material is going to start picking up as far as volume in the next few days or a couple of weeks. If there are any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Both the golf outings are on this weekend. So the main one is down in Columbus with the guys on Sunday, and then there's a friends and family event in Worcester. If you're wanting to get involved still, just let us know. Obviously a bit late in the day for begging, but there we go. We'll always try. With that, I will say thank you to Dr. Petrella, Dr. Gardner, and we will be back in 2 weeks' time. Again, we don't ramp this up to weekly until we get to Memorial Day. Thank you, folks. See you soon. Any questions, reach out to us.